Welcome to our regularly scheduled Thursday lunches, and I'm glad to see everybody here. Today's a special day because it's our normal Thursday lunch and for security studies and for the wider community, but also today we're co-sponsoring with the School of Foreign Service for the Centennial, and the theme that we're sponsoring as part of the Centennial is the environment. So this is a very appropriate topic for us to have today. Even though we're not really talking about the environment, we're talking about climate and security issues, and but it's all related. And well, we're very fortunate to have with us Greg Gershuny. That name should be very familiar to most of you here. Anybody who's been admitted to security studies should know the better half. You know? Greg is the other half. The better half is Jessica. So you got to know how to say things correctly there, without getting in trouble. You know? You're going to go back to work, but she'll still be here. No, but Greg is going to speak to us on a very important subject today. Obviously, very important in the news. Greg is a fellow at the Aspen Institute, and it's the James E. Rogers Energy Fellow at the Aspen Institute. And he's responsible for a lot of different things. The annual Energy Security Forum, the Forum on Global Energy, Economy and Security, and the Clean Energy Forum. Now, Greg has a long experience in energy as well as the government. He's worked at the White House, the Department of Energy, something that you all might be very interested in what he did at the White House, working transitions and White House jobs. So although that's not the focus of his talk today, I'm sure if after this, if you buttonhole him, he might give you some insights. Although, you know, different parties, different administrations, but the White House is the White House. And, so again, he's not going to talk on that today because the subject, I think, is more important than a single transition in the White House. This is a subject that is going to be with us, with you, for a long time to come. And it's a very important security issue. Even if you are you might be a climate change denier, I would submit to you that science is not on your side. And, you know, I will say that freely. Although, you know, with this beautiful weather that we're having today, I said to Greg earlier that if I was in charge of climate change, I'd make this weather stay fixed like it is right now, because it sure is beautiful. We are very fortunate to have a subject matter expert like Greg. And one last point to keep in mind is that while you're thinking about pre-registration that ends on Saturday, Greg will be teaching a course on energy security in the spring. You know, especially, I know you're going to like what you hear today, but you might like to hear it 14 times in the spring as well. Although I'm sure he'll change up his lectures a little bit. So without further ado, we're very happy to have you, Greg, and now I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Dave, Dave and Tom for having me, and thank you, Brittany, for helping set this all up. We're here to talk about the coming national security challenges of climate change. As Dave mentioned, I'm going to be teaching decision-making and energy security policy starting in January, so just that plug. But the last 7 years before I came to Aspen in January of this year, I spent at the White House and at the Department of Energy working with policymakers at the highest federal levels. First for the President's Economic Advisor, Larry Summers, then for the President's Science and Technology Advisor, Dr. John Holdren, and then at the Department of Energy for Dr. Ernie Moniz and his policy advisor, Melanie Kenderdine. So in that time, I got to work on a whole different group of issues, from space telescopes to science education, whether to lift the crude export ban, and how the U.S. should respond to Russia and the crisis in Ukraine. But one of the most important issues I got to work on in my time in government was climate change. And it wasn't the environmental aspects that drew me to this, but it was working with the Pentagon and State Department and the intelligence community and looking at the implications of climate change, not just on the US, but around the world. And as a leader in the world, what that would mean for US and national security. So with that, that's what we're going to talk about, the connections between a warming planet and potential national security issues. The time frame for the security issues that we're going to be talking about is going to be the next few decades. But some of the climate pieces are on a longer time scale, and so I'll flag those so there's not confusion between saying something that's going to happen in 10 years versus 50 or 100 years. So this is what I'm going to tell you. First, what's climate change? The very short version. I'm not a scientist, and so I'm a policy maker, and so this is the policy version of what is climate change. What are the impacts of climate change? And then third, what are the policies to mitigate climate change, and how do these policies impact national security? So I want everyone to close their eyes and think about climate change. All right, open your eyes. Is this what you were thinking about? So polar bears are very cute. You may have met Jessica and I's dog yesterday when she brought him to campus. But this isn't what we should be thinking about when we think about climate change. Polar bears are at risk, penguins, owls are at risk, but the impacts of climate change go much, much further than that. And that's why we shouldn't think of climate change just as a environmental issue, but as a national security issue, an environmental issue, and an economic issue. And I'm not going to talk very much about the economics of climate change, but one fact I'll throw out there is Citibank, in a report earlier this year, predicted that the impacts of climate change, if we don't do anything, would be, in the next 40 years, $72 trillion reduced from GDP, which is about 5% of the world GDP. I've seen numbers much larger, and I've seen other kind of evaluations of the cost of climate change, but Citibank is a pretty good, reliable source, and that's $72 trillion lost in the economy is a pretty big number. So, what is climate change? Greenhouse gases gather in the atmosphere, mostly carbon dioxide, but also methane and some of the other less well-known ones. And they allow sunlight in, but they don't allow heat to leave the atmosphere. So if we look at kind of the natural breathing of the planet, we have records going back 800,000 years because of ice cores that we dig in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Here's the last 400,000 years, and you can see the ups and downs of carbon in the atmosphere right up until about 200 years ago when we started the Industrial Revolution. So about 200 years ago, we started burning more coal, more wood, and the levels of carbon in the atmosphere went up above 300 parts per million, and now we're at above 400 parts per million, which many scientists say is kind of the tipping point for the warming planet. So it's not just a natural cycle, but we've broken that cycle and we've gone above and beyond what historically has happened on the Earth. So where do greenhouse gases come from? The first area are, I can't see that from over here, are direct emissions, which is agriculture, like cows put out methane when they release gas. When we drill mines and wells, we let out gases that were in there. And then land use, like deforestation, which you know that plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide, so when we cut trees down, there's less plants to process the carbon back into oxygen, and so the amount of carbon in the air increases. The reason that fossil fuels are called that is because they're literally the fossils of plants and animals that have been, over millions of years, been sequestered into the ground. So when we dig those up and set them on fire, we're releasing that carbon into the air. So oil, which we use mainly for transportation in cars, trucks, planes, ships, is about 21% of the greenhouse gases. Natural gas, which is the gas version of fossil fuels, is about 19%. And coal, which is largely blamed for a lot of climate change, is about 25% of greenhouse gases that we emit into the air. And this is not to say that things like carbon don't exist naturally. Like we saw before, they go up and down. But if we removed all the carbon from the air, the planet would be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit cooler. So we would be living on an icy globe. So it's kind of this delicate balance between too much and too little that we have to be careful of breaking. So now that we all know what climate change is, what are the impacts of climate change? I've broken this down into kind of 3 topics, one that leads to the others. So erratic climate and weather extremes, altered ecosystems and habitats, and then risks to human health and society. So this is a chart that shows the temperature globally. It's measured in over 2,000 places around the world by NASA and NOAA. The blue is the late 1800s. As you get into the orange, it's the mid 1900s, and then the orange and the red are the 21st century. The top line there that you see is this year. We've broken the heat record, the warmest record, every month this year so far, and then 15 of the hottest 16 years on record have been the last 15 years. So it's not just that it's getting warmer, but every year is getting warmer and warmer. And you can see back in January and February, it was significantly warmer than it had been in previous years by quite a bit. And so we're on track to have the warmest year on record, and there's no indication that that isn't going to happen in the years to come. This is a map of the US for the last 25 years and the temperature changes. So you can see the dark red is places that the average temperature has risen more than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 25 years. So this isn't something that's off in the future, but something that's already happening. So most of the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, most of the West and Alaska are already facing higher temperatures year-round than they had been even in the 90s. And then when we look forward, this shows days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see it's basically in the Southwest and Texas. But when you fast forward to 2060, you're talking about the whole Midwest is going to have weeks above 100 degrees. Places like Dallas is going to have 2 months above 100 degrees. Phoenix is above 100 degrees for most of the summer. And then you fast forward again to 2100, and you're talking about places like Philadelphia that it almost never gets over 100 degrees now. It's going to have a whole month during the summer over 100 degrees. And then places like Texas and Phoenix are going to spend months and months over 100 degrees. So it's hotter temperatures in more places for more days. Hotter temperatures lead to extreme weather. This is showing the increased number of billion-dollar weather events, whether it's hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, or other severe storms. From the early 80s to now, it's gone up, and it's not consistent every year, but the consistent thing is that it has increased. We spend between $20 and $55 billion a year annually for recovery in severe storms, and this is just in the US. So, warmer weather, warmer temperatures, more extreme weather lead to altered ecosystems and climate. We all know about the polar ice caps, which are decreasing from 1980 to 2012, which leads to sea level rise. And I want to preface the next thing I'm going to show by saying the comparison here is what we're on track to lock in by the end of this century. The sea level rise in these graphics isn't necessarily by 2100, because we know how much ice will melt, but we don't know necessarily how fast it'll melt. So I don't want anyone thinking I'm saying that this is what these places are going to look like by 2100, but they will at some point in the future. So this is New York. On the left is historic pollution, and on the right is what would happen if we don't do anything about climate change. So you can see that most of lower Manhattan is covered by water, including where the World Trade Center used to be, and most of Hoboken and Brooklyn are as well. Here's Shanghai, where 35 million people live, is all below the flood zone, which would displace tens of millions of people. And then Washington, D.C., which this all used to be swampland. So you see most of Southeast and Southwest is gone. Georgetown becomes waterfront property. The mall is gone, and there's a nice lake in the backyard of the White House. And Reagan National Airport is also gone. So as the ice melts, it increases the sea level. We don't know how fast the ice will melt, but it is melting, and the sea has already risen 8 centimeters just in the past few decades. Sea level rise leads to increased flooding. My hometown of Atlantic City, New Jersey is on there. We had 1 flood in the 50s. We had 26 floods in the last decade. Other coastal areas like Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, down in the Gulf of Mexico are all seeing increased flooding. In Houston last year, in 2015, there was a once-in-a-century flood. The whole city was flooded for over a week. I went down there for a conference just after, and they were just starting the recovery effort. The problem, though, is that this year, they also had a flood of similar magnitude. So when you have 2 once-in-a-century floods in 2 years, then that becomes a problem. It's not to say that there's going to be one next year, but it leads to questions of whether we should rename once-in-a-century. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, this was over the summer. Tens of thousands of people were displaced and lost their homes because of a long rainstorm that stalled over Baton Rouge. Ellicott City, Maryland, which is just an hour north of here, had a big flash flood in August. And then if you think it can only happen on the coast, Boulder, Colorado got as much rain in one day as they usually get in a whole year. And it caused massive flooding back in 2013, destroyed roads, and it killed a few people who got in the way of the rushing water. So switching gears to drought, the warmer temperatures lead to increased drought. China, their desert has expanded 21,000 square miles in the last 40 years, and it's increasing 1,300 square miles a year, which is displacing thousands and thousands of people in China. So as people from Shanghai are going to be moving inland, people from inland are going to be moving towards the coasts. In Africa, the risk of drought is increasing along the edges of the Sahara and in South Africa. In the Middle East, there's very high vulnerability to drought. Most of Iraq, Iran, into Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then in the western part of the US, there's increased risk of drought. California is just getting out of a 3-year drought right now. And so this becomes problematic because this is a lot of the area where our food is grown. And drought leads to wildfires as we march down our happy topic here. Wildfires are increasing. There's been a lot more just in the last couple of decades. And in coming decades, you're going to see even more risk of wildfires in the western part of the United States as the temperatures rise. Air quality issues. If you go to Delhi, if you go to Shanghai, or if you go to Beijing. In Beijing, just in the past year and a half, 7% of the time has been over 200 in the air quality measurements, which is very unhealthy. And then 2% of the time has been at the levels of hazardous where they advise you not to even leave your house. So it's getting worse there, and they're still trying to figure out ways to do this. In Los Angeles in the 80s, we had these issues, and we're able to clean up the air. And so hopefully China will also be able to make strides on this. So the first takeaway, the impacts of climate change have arrived, and they're already having severe impacts on the planet. They're going to get worse as time goes on, but to think that this is something that's 50 years off is to kind of sell short what's already happened. So we have increased carbon emissions and increased deforestation that leads to warmer climate, that leads to these issues. And then now we're going to talk about the secondary issues from climate change that will lead to national security issues. So risks to human health and society. 2 years ago, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel talked about climate change, that increased climate change will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic diseases, disputes over refugees, and destruction of natural disasters in regions across the globe. So the first of the three threat multipliers that I'm going to talk about, and then there's a fourth issue that's not related to climate change but is going to add to the problems, is food insecurity. Across areas across Africa and Asia are already facing severe food insecurity. Places in the US, urban areas also face food insecurity, where you can't get nutritionally adequate food for costs that are that are reasonable for the people trying to get the food. The inability to grow food locally and the drought and the floods are going to lead to that. And then reliance on cash crops, which happens in a lot of parts in the world, especially in Africa and South Asia, where crops are sold for profit as opposed to being grown for food. So this is the first of the threat multipliers. Second is water access security, which is where you can't get clean drinking water. By 2050, 3 billion people will have increased water scarcity, including 600 million Africans due to climate change. And so this is going to be a huge issue that's going to move populations around as they search for clean water to drink. And then the human health effects. The National Institutes of Health say that climate change could cause increased asthma, cancer, cardiovascular diseases, foodborne diseases, waterborne, and then increased stress related to climate change. So that, combined with population growth, which I want to stress is not a climate change issue, but it's an issue that will impact a planet that's warming. The population is going to grow another 32% between 2015 and 2050. In the 1800s, we had about 1 billion people on the planet, and now we're going to have about 9.7 billion. And most of the growth, or almost all the growth, is into the developing world. So India is going to increase by another 400 million people by 2050. Latin America, the Middle East is going to nearly double in that time. And then Africa. Africa in 1980 had 500 million people. Now Africa has 1.2 billion people, and by 2050 it's going to double again to 2.5 billion people. So all the issues that on food security, water security, human health security are all going to intensify as more and more people live on a continent that doesn't have the food and water access that it needs to support those people. Places like Nigeria is going to have a population greater than the US in an area smaller than the size of Texas and Oklahoma. Congo is going to double, Ethiopia is going to double, and then Africa as a whole is going to have nearly as many people as China and India combined. So, what this could lead to, and this is what the Secretary of Defense was arguing, is increased poverty, increased corruption, political instability, increased non-voluntary migration, and potentially increased radicalization. So, coming back to this, you can see how the warmer climate is leading to these issues that lead to these national security issues. And specifically the migration issues that I'm sure you've all been talking about with regard to Syria is viewed as just the beginning. If you have tens of millions of people who don't have access to food and water, they're going to go to where they can find food and water. There was also, in Louisiana, the New York Times had an article a couple months ago about the first US climate refugees, people that can't live in the areas that are below sea level anymore because it's just not sustainable. No one's going to insure their houses for flood insurance that where they don't have, where they're getting flooded every few years. So, if we don't do something about warming planet, a lot of bad things could happen. That's takeaway number 2. So, what are we doing about this? So there's 3 parts of climate change policy. Mitigation, which is the primary policy that we've been pursuing for the last few decades, is the reduction of putting carbon into the atmosphere. So you can think of it as like going on a diet. If you eat salad all the time, then you're putting less bad things into your body. Adaptation is getting ready for the bad things to happen. So it's doing things like preparing power plants for floods, putting wires underground instead of on telephone poles so that if hurricanes hit, they don't get blown over. And you can think of that as preparation, like going to the doctor and getting tested for diabetes. And then reduction, which are technologies that we don't quite have yet, but we will, and we're putting, the government is putting money into research and development for things like sucking carbon out of the air and reducing the actual amount of carbon that's in the air, carbon capture through giant fans that they put, is like exercise. And that's not an actual picture of me at the gym, so.
Artist concession.
Yes, that's an artist rendering of me at the gym. So the main policies that we're pursuing, and this has been in the news a lot lately, are mitigation policies. The Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed a year ago, and the same countries are in Marrakesh and Morocco right now working on implementation. 196 countries signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement. It's 98.8% of all the greenhouse gases. The only countries that haven't signed on are Iraq, Syria, Nicaragua, and Uzbekistan. Even North Korea signed on.
All right.
Kim Jong-un.
He signed on to it. So almost every country signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement. Each country got to submit their plan for what they're going to do to fight climate change. So the US is going to reduce greenhouse gases 26 to 28% in the next decade. China is going to peak their carbon emissions by 2030 and then increase their clean energy. India is going to reduce their emissions intensity, which is the amount of carbon put out per dollar of GDP, by 2030, and then the EU is going to reduce their actual greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. But what does that mean for the actual impacts of climate change? Because a lot of what's been reported is that Paris isn't enough, and that's right. So the red line here that's going up is the path that we're on now if we don't do anything, including not doing Paris. That's the really bad path. The yellow line is what happens if we actually implement Paris. So if we do the things we say we're going to do, and we continue to do those things into the future, so this goes out to 2100. So this is continued ambition. We basically flatten the line out, which isn't enough. But if in 10 years, we get to the end of the Paris Agreement and we agree to additional measures, if we increase our ambition, then we get to a point where we get to a level that we have a chance to actually reduce the temperature of the planet significantly. And so here, if we do what we're doing now, there's a 90% chance that we're going to be over 3 degrees Celsius, which is the scenario where in the future New York and Washington and Shanghai are all underwater. If we just do Paris and continue that, there's a 90% chance we're going to stay under 4 degrees. But we're not going to meet the mark of Paris, which is to stay under 2 degrees. Even if we increase our ambition, there's still only a 30% chance that we're going to stay under 2 degrees. We'd actually have to get to negative emissions by the end of the century to have a 50-50 chance of meeting our 2 degree goal. So it's pretty bleak, but the mitigation combined with the adaptation where we get ready for the impacts of climate change can get us to a place that we have a sustainable, habitable world. So national security positives of the climate action that we're taking now. So 2 years ago, the G7 leaders put a group of energy security principles together. This was in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. And 2 of them are diversification of energy sources. So as countries increase their clean energy, so it's solar, renewables, hydro, nuclear, they're getting less fuel, which is susceptible to disruption, which increases their energy security, which increases their national security. Then the other main thing is improving infrastructure resilience, which is another G7 principle, and that is also something that we need to do to prepare for climate change. So it's kind of a 2 birds, 1 stone kind of scenario. But then the national security negatives of climate change action, of the actual actions that we're taking, a lot of people are proponents of electrifying everything because electricity can be cleaner, it's cleaner than gas, it's cleaner than coal, but increased electrification leads to more cybersecurity threats. Nowadays, the US isn't building nuclear power plants around the world. Russia and China are building most of the plants around the world, and that could potentially lead to increased proliferation and safety issues because they don't necessarily build them to the same standards that US companies do. And then control of nuclear power and uranium. And what that means is that when Russia goes into a country and says, do you want us to build you a nuclear power plant, they finance it, they provide the uranium, and then they take away the spent fuel, and they're able to use that as leverage because the country has to pay them back, and the country has to rely on them to take away the nuclear waste when they're done. And so it increases the potential for bad actors on the nuclear issues. Also, the US used to produce most of the uranium in the world. Now Russia produces more than 90% of the uranium for nuclear power plants, just in the past 20 years. And then critical materials for renewables. So one of the things people don't really talk about is, especially batteries, but also solar panels and windmills, rely on critical materials mined from the ground. 99% of those critical materials are mined in China. And it's a very, very dirty process to mine those. So that's why we actually don't do it in the US. We have them, but we don't mine them because it's such a dirty endeavor to do. But we're relying on that for everything from our iPhone batteries to electric vehicle batteries to windmills and kind of beyond. So takeaway number 3 is we're not doing enough right now to mitigate climate change or to prepare the impacts of climate change. So I was thinking about how do you think about this? And one of the things that I was looking at was Ryan Henry was the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense during President Bush's administration, and he came up with this rubric for thinking about non-state actors, terrorism, and this is one way to look at it, but climate change doesn't neatly fit into any of these, because when we look at who are the actors in the climate change story, who's the villain here, it's everybody. And so we all need to figure out how we can both personally rely less on carbon emitting energy, but also do things globally that reduce carbon. And so because you will be working in the national security field as these impacts begin and continue and get worse, you're going to be the ones to think about these issues and how they impact, whether you're at DoD, whether you're at a company, or whether you're at a think tank. But here's a few questions for you to consider, and I'm happy to discuss. Oh, that was the last takeaway. We don't even know how to think about climate change in a national security context yet, let alone prepare and take action.
Yeah, Greg, that was quite depressing.